case you've defended has been the most difficult?
Well, we're involved in so many cases around the world, and we don't take usually individual cases of individuals. We usually take a country situation. So we'll talk about, for example, now we're talking about women's rights in Iran, and or we talk about in Pakistan a woman who's sentenced to be killed because they say she insulted the Prophet Muhammad, and so we talk about human rights. That is an individual case. So I'm not sure if I can easily pick out one, because in 10 years there have been so many cases in so many country situations, and it's very much an ongoing battle where we're speaking out and countries are interrupting us. And last week Cuba tried to challenge our credentials. You know, we have a badge at the UN that we're an NGO, and there's a committee of 19 governments that sits in New York, and they decide who gets the badge. Who are the governments on the committee? Cuba, Nicaragua, Iran, Pakistan, China. And so they hate us because we bring victims from their country. They hate us. So, and in Cuba, we bring people who were tortured in prisons and people who were beaten and arrested. And we do it more than any other group. And we're a small group, and it's terrible that we're the ones who are doing the most on Cuba. There are other groups that should do it, but that's the reality. And so they complained and they tried to challenge our ability to have the badge. And luckily, they were too late. So I just mentioned that it's just a constant battle on situations, and I don't think I could come up with one.
Okay. Do you have hope that someday the world and the UN will change their perception of Israel? Do you think it can happen?
Well, the United Nations is reflecting attitudes around the world, and we have to keep a historical perspective. The attitudes towards Jews for thousands of years in Christian society were hostile. The Christian society, they said that in Europe and other countries, here I understand in Mexico, Jews were burned at the stake in Inquisition. I was explained that you had the Inquisition here in Mexico hundreds of years ago. Is the Jewish state, and inherits the hatred and the stereotypes that were directed against individual Jews, where Jews were blamed in the Middle Ages when there was the Black Plague and millions died in Europe. They blamed the Jews. They said, you poisoned the wells. And today, if you sit at a United Nations meeting, you hear that if there's violation of the rights of women or of children or the environment, it's Israel. And they condemn Israel. At the World Health Organization, they condemn Israel. At the International Labor Organization, they condemn Israel. At the Culture Organization, UNESCO, they condemn Israel. Israel is the only country in the world that is condemned at UNESCO every year in 10 resolutions. Syria was a member of UNESCO's Human Rights Committee. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So I think we have to have an historical perspective, and it's attitudes that were prevalent in Christian societies, attitudes in Islamic societies, and the United Nations reflects the hatred that today is directed at the Jewish state instead of at individual Jews. So unfortunately, I don't see it going away tomorrow, but there are people around the world who can see the basic facts, that dictatorships try to attack Israel to protect themselves, and we see very interesting people around the world who speak out against this bias. Kofi Annan did a little bit, Ban Ki-moon did a little bit. I mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin, who founded human rights. They were the greatest defenders of the state of Israel. People forget that. When the United Nations began to condemn Israel in the early 60s, and especially in the late 60s, Eleanor Roosevelt condemned it. She said, why are we doing a UN resolution condemning Israel for defending itself in the Golan? They were attacked by Syria. The United Nations shouldn't do this. She spoke out. And René Cassin in the 1960s and 70s, when the Human Rights Commission became hijacked, he spoke out. In Tehran at a UN meeting when they singled out Israel, he was the French delegate and he walked out and he spoke out. So I think there are great people in human rights who want to preserve the integrity of human rights principles, because if you have a standard on human rights that you apply selectively, it's no longer a standard. So I think that we will continue to speak out for what is just and what is consistent with the founding principles of human rights. Israel, we talked before in my lecture about countries that do not allow any open criticism at all. They don't have free elections. They don't have freedom of speech. You can't criticize them anywhere. No independent judiciary. Israel is the opposite. Israel has the most free press. The Knesset, you can be an Arab member of Knesset who's calling for terrible things against the state of Israel, and you're allowed to say it, and you're elected in the Knesset, and you have diplomatic immunity, parliamentary immunity. And you have a newspaper like Haaretz, which is attacking Netanyahu, its prime minister, every single day, attacking his wife, and you have the most vigorous criticism. It's been called a hyper-democracy in that sense. Now, I think that is to Israel's benefit. I think you have a healthy society. You can always have too much criticism. It can be not constructive. But I think it's a sign of health that a society, if there's problems, Israelis are very blunt. They're not polite. They don't say, oh, I like you. If they don't like you, they tell you, I don't like you. And Israel has a very blunt society. And I think it's a sign of health. And the fact that you mentioned various groups, whether it's Haaretz or filmmakers who criticize Israel, generally, if it's done properly, it's a healthy thing to have a vigorous conversation. And if what a newspaper is saying isn't true, then others will respond to it, and somehow in the debate we'll get to the truth. So on the whole, I think it's healthy for Israel to have institutions that criticize the army and the government and the president and the prime minister. I think it's healthy. Now, at the same time, we have to understand that there are people outside of Israel who want to abuse that. There are people at the United Nations, dictatorships, Arab and Islamic countries that want to demonize Israel, that want to portray Israel as an anti-human country, who are very happy to take and say it's an Israeli newspaper who said it. It's not me, it's in Haaretz that said apartheid, or it's an Israeli movie. Now, of course, Israeli filmmakers, if you make a movie about Israel, and it's a regular movie about this or that, and Israel is a regular country with pimples and not pimples, and the true complexity, and you apply to the European Union for money, and they're not so interested. But if you make a movie and you say Israel is a terrible country, suddenly you'll get hundreds of thousands of dollars for funding. And many filmmakers make movies that are very, I believe, distorted against Israel. So I think we can have two ideas at the same time. Within Israel, we should encourage vigorous debate, and that's a positive thing. Even if there are people in the world who will seize upon this, who will exploit it and try to use it against Israel, that's a reality. And I do think that some of critics within Israel do need to be aware of how their words are being misused. I don't ask them to be silent, say what you want to say, but when they use certain terms, when they use apartheid, which is absurd, when you have millions of Arabs within Israel who have the vote, who are in the Knesset, to use a word like apartheid is ridiculous. So within Israel's internal debate, I think some groups should be mindful. I'm not saying restrain themselves, but if they're going to use certain inflammatory terms, they should be mindful that there are anti-Semites, there are haters and racists around the world who are only too happy to use them. So I think one has to have a certain tension, and I'm not sure that some of the groups in Israel are sensitive to that. I see some of them coming to the United Nations. I saw a left-wing human rights group in Israel came to the UN that was speaking at a committee that was run by the Libyans and the Syrians. If you're a human rights group, you're going to do business with Gaddafi and Assad? How ridiculous is that? So I think there's a naivete. There's a naivete among some of these groups and who are letting themselves be used.
Two more questions. Some member states and general public think Israel's reaction towards Hezbollah and Hamas were disproportionate. How do you respond to those allegations?
Well, we have to understand what disproportionality is. There are some who misuse the term. We say, well, we had a war this summer, and there were 2,000 Palestinians killed. We don't know how many were Hamas fighters and how many weren't. Maybe half were Hamas fighters. And they say on Israel's side, you had less than 100 casualties, so it's disproportionate. Well, that's not how it works. The idea of disproportionality in law is when you're attacking a target, you can use as much force to stop the threat and not more than that. And if you're attacking a one person with a gun, you can't drop a nuclear bomb on him and kill 1 million people. That's disproportionate. But you can do what you need to stop the threat, and it has to be disproportionate to how many innocent people might be killed around. And it's not a question of saying, well, 2,000 were killed. We know how Israel acted during the war. I was in Israel during the summer, and I saw when thousands of rockets were being fired at Israeli population centers, Israel did things that no other army has done. They give warnings before they attack. They call them, they send them text messages, they send them leaflets. And Colonel Richard Kemp, who was a British officer who commanded British forces in Afghanistan, he spoke at the United Nations 5 years ago. And he said, as the commander of British forces, who worked with the United Nations peacekeepers, worked with American troops, he said, no army in the history of warfare has done more to avoid harming civilians in a combat zone than the Israel Defense Forces did in Operation Cast Lead in 2009, and he said the same thing this summer. He's not Jewish, he's not from Israel, no one's paying him, he's a retired military officer, and he's saying that the most democratic countries of the world, when they fight wars, how does America fight in Afghanistan and Iraq? They bomb without giving warnings and things like that. So Israel has a particular challenge because Hamas is cynical. They know that the United Nations is waiting to use the story. They know that human rights groups are waiting to exploit it. And so they deliberately fire from civilian areas, inviting, for them, they win. If Israel attacks them and kills civilians, for them it's a victory. Israel regrets every innocent civilian who's killed and does everything they can to avoid calling off airstrikes if they see civilians, where Hamas wins for every one of their own civilians that are killed. And that's the tragedy that we face.
Are you familiar with the work of WIZO? And what do you think about this organization?
Well, I'm very familiar with the work of WIZO because in Geneva, Switzerland, there has always been active WIZO people, and I know that what they support in Israel, daycare centers and helping women and helping children and helping the needy. And I know they built a daycare center in Sderot with protection against missiles. I mean, it's amazing that this thing needs to happen, but WIZO is there to do it. So, and I'm going to be, in 2 days, I'm going to be at the WIZO Gala in Florida to receive an award from them. And I know the people who work at WIZO are dedicated volunteers who do amazing work, who give of their time, give of their money to support incredible humanitarian work in Israel. And I fully support the amazing humanitarian work that WIZO does.
Do you feel there were human rights violations on part of Israel?
I think that that Israel was. I was in Israel. I think that speak about the big picture is that Israel was a democracy that was attacked by a terrorist group.
Okay.
That was attacked with thousands of rockets.
Okay.
That the war was preceded by the kidnapping and murder of 3 teenagers. And that Israel's response, I fully support what Colonel Kemp said.
Okay.
That Israel's response, Israel does more to avoid harming civilians than any other army in the world.
Okay.
Now, does that mean that in that conflict that lasted 2 months, where Israeli soldiers went into Gaza, that every soldier did the perfect thing at all times? Of course not.
Okay.
Of course not. No. I'll continue answering. And there have been allegations made of various things, and I wanted Israel to investigate, and I wasn't there. And so on particular incidents, I can't speak to them. And Israel's investigating particular incidents.
Okay.
And if it's found that certain soldiers did things that were wrong, it's entirely possible. And they should be investigated and prosecuted just like any other country. I come from Canada, and in Canada, there are soldiers in Africa, peacekeepers who did bad things. So I never say, I worked in Israel in the Supreme Court, and there were human rights petitions not dealing with war. There's human rights issues all the time in every country. And there's no human being who doesn't do bad things. There's no country, whether it's America, Canada, or Israel, that doesn't do bad things. But given the threat that Israel has, attacked by a terrorist group with cynically attacks deliberately from civilian areas, places their rockets in civilian areas knowing that the only way for Israel to stop the rocket is to fire at them.